Every empire that has ever come apart reaches a specific threshold, a threshold where the architects of the system stop defending it, where the official story buckles under its own weight, where the rehearsed language of strength gives way, and the conversations that were supposed to stay behind closed doors start finding their way out into the open, impossible to contain, impossible to retract. That threshold arrived in Iran, and it did not arrive through some anonymous whistleblower operating from a hidden server. It did not arrive from an exiled activist speaking into a camera from a London flat or a Los Angeles studio. It arrived from within the walls of the Iranian parliament itself, from the elected representatives of the Islamic Republic standing at the podium on the official record and speaking words that the regime has invested 4 decades of effort into ensuring no Iranian official would ever say publicly. The war cannot be won, not in those precise words. Governments almost never speak with that kind of naked honesty. But in every functional, substantive, and politically irreversible sense that language operates in statecraft, that is exactly what was communicated. And the full weight of what was said, who said it, from what position they said it, and what it means for the tens of millions of human beings caught inside the accelerating wreckage of contemporary Iran is so consequential, so permanent, and so thoroughly incompatible with every narrative the Islamic Republic has fed its population across the last 2 years that this story has to be told from the ground up. So let's start with the number that reorders every other piece of information. The number is 930 billion, denominated in US dollars. That is the figure that Iranian parliamentary researchers placed before a formal session in May 2026, their own calculation of the total economic destruction inflicted on the country by the military conflict, the American-led naval blockade, and the domestic collapse that both have triggered $930 billion in a country whose entire pre-war economic output was roughly $367 billion annually. This is not a setback. This is not a wound the country recovers from in a decade. This is a number that describes the erasure of Iran's economy 2.5 times over. To fully understand the seismic nature of this figure appearing in a parliamentary session, you have to understand what Iranian parliamentary sessions have historically looked like. The legislature of the Islamic Republic has never been a chamber of genuine independent accountability. For 40 years, it has functioned as a carefully stage-managed forum where disagreements about the pace of executing Supreme Leader directives were tolerated, but where any fundamental challenge to the system's legitimacy or competence was quietly extinguished before it could take root. The fact that the parliament's own research apparatus produced this number and delivered it in open session is a signal of something extraordinary. It means someone inside the establishment made a calculated decision that sustaining the illusion of victory had become more dangerous than admitting defeat. That is a remarkable institutional shift. It means the destruction has become so visibly, tangibly present in the everyday lives of ordinary Iranians, that denying it any further would cost the parliament whatever residual credibility it still holds as an institution. But the 930 billion figure was not the statement that detonated across every intelligence service monitoring Iranian internal communications. The phrase that did that was spoken by a parliamentarian whose identity under these circumstances matters less than the institutional authority of the position from which they spoke. The statement, confirmed by Iran International and cross-checked against leaked session transcripts circulating in Iranian diaspora channels, was unambiguous. The Islamic Republic no longer possesses the financial capacity, the military capability, or the social cohesion to sustain the current conflict. Let that land for a moment. This person is not an opposition figure. This is not someone the regime could dismiss as a foreign plant or a seditious provocateur. This is a sitting member of the Iranian parliament, a body that, for all its limitations, exists within the formal constitutional structure of the Islamic Republic, saying on the record, in a recorded session, that the state is incapable of continuing to fight. The language used invoked 3 distinct categories of incapacity, each worth examining individually because each one exposes a different layer of the catastrophe. The first category is financial. Iran's oil export revenues, the mechanism through which the state has funded everything from civil servant salaries to food subsidies to military operations for the past 8 decades, have been cut by approximately 75% since the American naval blockade intensified. Before the blockade, the country was exporting roughly 1.71 million barrels per day. That figure has now collapsed to approximately 567,000 barrels per day. The resulting financial hemorrhage runs to $500 million every single day, in a country where the government is distributing $7 food vouchers to citizens to hold back starvation, in a country where the minimum monthly wage sits at $130 In a country where the International Monetary Fund has confirmed inflation running at 68.9% for 2026, with an expected economic contraction of 6.1%, and that estimate was calculated before the blockade reached its current severity. The real has collapsed to 1.32 million per US dollar. A single block of cheese costs the equivalent of $5 in a country where millions of families cannot stretch their budget to buy it. The second category is military. And this is the point where the story moves beyond economic shock and into something operationally terrifying. Because what the military dimension of Iran's incapacity reveals is something that no official spokesperson, not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Brussels, has yet stated plainly in public. Here is a fact about military collapse that most people outside of military history do not know. Armies do not typically disintegrate because they exhaust their weapons. They disintegrate because they exhaust the money needed to keep paying the people carrying those weapons. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the paramilitary backbone of the Iranian state for 4 decades, the organization that built and directed Iran's missile program, its nuclear hedging strategy, its proxy networks across the Middle East, its domestic repression machinery, has not been paying its soldiers reliably for months. Internal communications obtained and verified by Iran International confirm that members of Iran's police special units had their salary payments disrupted, not once, not twice, but across 3 consecutive payment cycles. By the third time, the personnel simply did not show up, not to protest deployments, not to check in. They did not appear because they could not feed their families. And a belief system that cannot cover the rent ceases to function as a motivation. At one documented installation, approximately 350 personnel had abandoned their posts. In certain units, desertion rates have reportedly approached 90%. These figures are not products of hostile foreign intelligence agencies attempting to demoralize Iranian forces. They are circulating through the internal communications of the Iranian security apparatus itself. The detail that has gone almost entirely unreported in Western media is this. IRGC personnel have been documented refusing to transport wounded regular Army soldiers to available medical facilities even when hospitals were open and operational. Think carefully about what that behavioral pattern tells you about an institution. When members of an organization refuse to assist the wounded of a nominally allied unit, the explanation is not brutality. The explanation is fragmentation. The organization has ceased to function as a unified command and has broken into competing factions, each one hoarding its own resources, each one calculating its own survival independently of any institutional mission. That is not a military force. That is a collection of armed individuals calculating which direction offers the best exit. Regular Army units on active deployment have been reported operating without adequate food, water, and ammunition. Air Force pilots have reportedly refused combat assignments following confirmed aircraft losses. The military dimension of the parliamentary admission is not rhetorical flourish, it is arithmetic. You cannot prosecute a war with an army that has gone unpaid, that is deserting at 90% rates, and whose wounded are being abandoned in the field by their own supposed allies. The third category of incapacity acknowledged in that parliamentary session is the one the regime has fought hardest to suppress, because it is the one that poses an existential threat to every individual who has ever held power inside the Islamic Republic. The social contract, the unspoken arrangement between the state and the population it governs, has not been strained. It has not been tested, it has been shredded, incinerated, and the debris scattered to the wind. The events of January 8th and 9th, 2026 are the essential reference point here, and they cannot be referenced without confronting their full dimensions, without flinching. Between 30,000 and 36,500 Iranian citizens were killed by their own security forces across approximately 48 hours. Not over weeks of sustained crackdown, not over the slow grind of a prolonged suppression campaign, in 48 hours. The Amnesty International researchers, who have documented every cycle of Iranian state violence since the revolution through 2009, 2019, and 2022, described the January crackdown as without precedent in the entire history of their work on Iran. The uprising had begun on December 28, 2025, ignited by economic disintegration, specifically by merchants watching the currency dissolve in real time in Tehran's bazaars. Within 5 days, it had extended to all 31 Iranian provinces simultaneously. Government offices were stormed in western Iran. Security forces were driven out of Qom, the clerical heartland, the spiritual nucleus of the theocracy, by crowds chanting slogans that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. In Loristan, in Shaharmahal and Bakhtiari province, neighborhoods became combat zones. The regime made its decision and then executed that decision with a ferocity that has permanently reshaped the psychological terrain of Iranian society. 2 million people have lost their livelihoods since the blockade intensified. Urban destitution in Tehran, Mashhad, Ahvaz, and Karaj has advanced to a stage that analysts are describing as a total dissolution of the social contract, not a widening inequality gap, not a housing affordability crisis, a structural disintegration of the entire framework through which people organize their lives, their households, their conception of what tomorrow might hold. And the parliament, the institution the Islamic Republic created to give its citizens the performance of representation, stood up in formal session and acknowledged that the population's capacity to absorb further punishment has been completely depleted. That is what the parliamentary statement actually meant. Not merely that the finances have collapsed, not merely that the military is fracturing, but that the people, the 85 million human beings whose daily existence is shaped by decisions made in Tehran, have reached the absolute limit of what can be endured. While the parliament was delivering its admission, something almost hallucinatory was unfolding at the summit of Iranian power. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who came to the position following his father, along with IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and a tight circle of senior guard officials, have constructed what sources describe as a security perimeter around the supreme leader that functions less like a protective detail and more like a political quarantine. Official government correspondence intended for the supreme leader is reportedly being intercepted before it arrives. Elected President Masoud Pezeshkian, who won his election in 2025 on a platform of moderation and diplomatic re-engagement, has reportedly requested urgent meetings with Khamenei on multiple occasions. Every single request has gone unanswered. His attempts to appoint a new intelligence minister following the Israeli assassination of his predecessor have been blocked at every turn. Every candidate he proposed was rejected by Vahidi on the grounds that wartime conditions require sensitive positions to remain under direct IRGC authority. Iran International describes the civilian government as being in a state of complete political paralysis. That is a diplomatic formulation for something far more alarming. The elected government of Iran cannot govern. The man the Iranian constitution designates as supreme leader cannot be reached by the officials constitutionally empowered to advise him. The parliament that represents the Iranian people is making formal admissions of military defeat that no one in the IRGC command structure has sanctioned. What you are watching is not a government under strain. What you are watching is a power structure that is fractured into competing authorities that no longer coordinate, no longer trust one another, and no longer share even the most basic consensus on the fundamental question any government must be able to answer. What are we actually trying to accomplish? Here is the detail that explains everything else and that almost no analyst has articulated plainly enough. The IRGC has seized total control of the Iranian state at precisely the moment when controlling the Iranian state is the most perilous position it is possible to occupy. The IRGC's entire institutional model was engineered around perpetual external threat. Every time Iran faced outside pressure, every sanction cycle, every diplomatic confrontation, every military flashpoint, the IRGC expanded its economic footprint by crowding out civilian competitors under the banner of national security. The IRGC operates construction conglomerates. It runs telecommunications infrastructure. It holds interests in petrochemical facilities and banking. It constructed an empire by positioning itself as the irreplaceable guarantor of regime survival. That model functions beautifully when the regime survives. But the IRGC has now assumed total control of a state approaching insolvency while simultaneously losing a war, losing its army, and losing its population. The IRGC command now owns every consequence of every decision. When the last financial lifeline of the Iranian state is finally severed, the IRGC will be holding the instrument when history inscribes the cause of death. And the danger does not diminish with collapse, it compounds. The IRGC's institutional incentive to accelerate uranium enrichment to reach nuclear threshold before economic disintegration forces a settlement actually increases as the situation deteriorates. A financially insolvent, internally fragmented, externally blockaded regime, controlled by a paramilitary organization whose institutional survival depends on maintaining a nuclear threat, operating without functional civilian oversight, with a supreme leader who cannot be reached. That is the nuclear security nightmare scenario that every think tank in Washington and every intelligence service in Europe has been wargaming in theoretical terms for 2 decades. It is no longer theoretical. The American naval blockade on Iranian oil exports is not a conventional military campaign in any traditional sense. It is an exercise in applied mathematics, and the math is closing in. Iran was pumping crude directly into tankers anchored offshore, not as delivery vessels but as floating storage facilities, because the country cannot afford to halt oil production. The underground reservoir damage caused by shutting wells improperly is catastrophic and irreversible, but it also cannot export the oil it is producing. Satellite imagery and Bloomberg Energy Desk analysis calculated that Iran's combined onshore and offshore storage capacity provides somewhere between 14 and 42 days of operational breathing room. That window is narrowing. When the floating storage reaches capacity and the onshore tanks top out, Iran will have no choice but to shut the wells. When the wells go dark, the last functioning revenue mechanism of the Iranian state goes with them. What follows is binary, either a military campaign costing hundreds of billions of dollars or a negotiated settlement that preserves some core Iranian capacities. The blockade is not bombing Iran. It is not providing the regime with the foreign attack narrative. It is historically weaponized to consolidate domestic support during internal crises. It is not fire and wreckage. It is time and mathematics and the slow hydraulic pressure of a financial architecture being drained from its foundation upward. Every serious analysis of Iran's strategic position eventually arrives at Russia and China, because the embedded assumption in that analysis is that Iran has powerful enough patrons that those patrons will not permit the Islamic Republic to collapse. That assumption requires fundamental revision. Russia's relationship with the IRGC-dominated Iranian state was constructed on a very specific foundation: weapons transfers, energy leverage, and institutional transactions that operate outside civilian accountability structures. The Kremlin has never been invested in the welfare of Iran's civilian population or the trajectory of its political development. It has been invested in Iran as a supplier of drones for Ukraine, as a customer for Russian military hardware, and as a strategic complicating factor in American calculations. A total Iranian state collapse producing a power vacuum on Russia's southern periphery, adjacent to the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Caspian energy infrastructure, is not something Moscow wants, but Russia cannot rescue Iran. Russia is itself under severe financial strain from its own war and its own sanctions regime. It can absorb discounted Iranian crude when it flows. It cannot inject the hundreds of billions required to stabilize a collapsing economy. China's calculation runs along parallel lines. Beijing had been receiving Iranian oil at heavily discounted rates, a significant strategic advantage. A collapsed Iran delivers nothing to anyone, including China. But China's interest is in stable supply chains and in positioning itself as an indispensable economic partner for whoever emerges from the ruins of the current Iranian state. China is not going to exhaust its diplomatic capital rescuing an IRGC command structure that is simultaneously destroying diplomatic off-ramps and accelerating nuclear enrichment. Beijing will observe, calculate, and maneuver itself into a position of usefulness to whatever arrangement follows. Neither Russia nor China will save the Islamic Republic. They are strategic spectators, working out which configuration of the wreckage best serves their own interests. The parliamentary admission of defeat in Tehran was not followed by emergency assistance from Moscow or Beijing. It was followed by silence. The questions that serious analysts are actively debating right now are not whether another wave of mass protest is coming. The conditions for popular uprising in Iran are objectively more severe today than they were in December 2025, when the largest internal challenge to the Islamic Republic since the revolution itself erupted across all 31 provinces simultaneously. The questions are, what form does the next eruption take? And does the security apparatus that massacred 30,000 people in 48 hours still retain the financial, organizational, and motivational capacity to suppress it? Every indicator points in one direction. Salary arrears now spanning 3 consecutive payment cycles in police special units, desertion rates approaching 90% in certain formations, Air Force pilots declining combat assignments, regular Army units running short of food and water, unemployment cascading through the civilian workforce, IRGC elements refusing to assist the wounded of Allied units, an elected president who cannot secure a meeting with the supreme leader, a parliament that has gone on record acknowledging military defeat and economic annihilation. The security apparatus that exists today is not the apparatus of January 2026. It has been eroded by months of unpaid salaries, by desertion, by the psychological burden of having participated in the killing of tens of thousands of fellow citizens, and by the lived, visceral, immediate knowledge available to anyone enduring it that the system they are being asked to defend cannot deliver the basic things that make service worth its cost. An institution that kills 30,000 people to purchase one additional season of survival has not demonstrated strength. It has demonstrated that consent and legitimacy have evaporated, and that the only remaining mechanism of control is the willingness of armed individuals to fire into crowds. When those individuals stop showing up to work, the mechanism fails. The parliamentary admission is not merely a political statement. It is a signal propagating through every level of Iranian society, communicating to everyone inside the system that the people who built it and maintained it have concluded it cannot go on. That signal does not fade, it accumulates. It reaches the soldier who has not received a paycheck in 3 months. It reaches the civil servant running the calculation of whether the position is still worth the moral weight it carries. It reaches the IRGC commander weighing whether loyalty to the institution serves his personal survival, or whether survival now requires putting distance between himself and the institution. There is a concept in structural engineering called progressive collapse. It describes what happens when a load-bearing element fails, transfers its load to adjacent elements, which then fail in sequence, each failure accelerating the next until the entire structure comes down, not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the cascading failure of components that were already operating beyond their design tolerances. The Iranian economy is failing, transferring its load to the financial system. The financial system is failing, transferring its load to the security apparatus. The security apparatus is fracturing, transferring its load to the IRGC. The IRGC has seized total power at the precise moment it is least equipped to wield it, because holding power when the treasury is empty means owning every political and social consequence of the bankruptcy alone, without a civilian government to absorb blame or negotiate exits. The supreme leader cannot be reached. The elected president cannot govern. The parliament has acknowledged defeat. The soldiers have stopped being paid. The regime that massacred 30,000 of its own citizens in 48 hours to purchase one more season of survival has now discovered that seasons carry a price and that the cost of the next one is something it can no longer name. History has been here before. The Soviet Union did not collapse because NATO defeated it on a battlefield. It collapsed because the financial mechanisms holding the loyalty structure of its governing class together gave out, and the day officials calculated that the system could no longer deliver what it had promised them. The institutional commitment to that system evaporated overnight. The Gaddafi regime, the Assad regime, the Ceausescu regime. In each case, the structure that appeared monolithic from the outside was in reality a coalition of interests held together by flows of money and patronage. When the flows stopped, the coalition dissolved. The Iranian parliament has now stated in recorded session that the flows have stopped, that the war is lost, that the capacity to continue does not exist. What comes next, whether it is a negotiated capitulation, an internal power seizure by the pragmatist faction of the IRGC, a total state collapse, or a desperate nuclear escalation by commanders who have exhausted every other option, will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of the entire Middle Eastern order. 85 million people are living inside that uncertainty right now. The oil storage tankers are filling up. The soldiers are walking home. The parliament has spoken.